最后，我们想来看一下Norman Foster。那 Norman Foster 大家应该都比较熟悉了吧
？As an architect, you design for the present with an awareness of the past, for a future which is essentially.
这句话是重要的。他说，作为建筑师，你是为现在做设计，然后你观察跟整理过去的东西，拿来支撑现在这个设计。但是你这个建筑物一盖好，就会迈向未来，而那个未来你其实都不了解。
The green agenda is probably the most important agenda and issue of the day. And I'd like to share some experience. Over the last 40 years, we celebrate our 40th anniversary this year. And to explore and to touch on some observations about the nature of sustainability, how far you can anticipate what follows from it, what are the threats, what are the possibilities, the challenges, the opportunities. I think that I've said in the past, many, many years ago, before anybody even invented the concept of a green agenda, that it wasn't about fashion, it was about survival. But what I never said, and what I'm really going to make the point, is that really green is cool. I mean, all the projects which have in some way been inspired by that agenda are about a celebratory lifestyle, in a way celebrating the places and the spaces which determine the quality of life. I rarely actually quote anything, so I'm going to try and find a piece of paper, if I can, which somebody at the end of last year ventured the thought about what for that individual, as a kind of important observer, analyst, writer, a guy called Thomas Friedman, who wrote in the Herald Tribune about 2006.
Thomas Friedman, 有人认识他吗？
对，就是那个世界是平的作者。在2007年的时候，他还没有那么有名，所以他说 "A guy called Thomas Friedman"。如果现在他介绍他，大概不是这样介绍。
I think the most important thing to happen in 2006 was that living and thinking green hit Main Street. We reached a tipping point this year where living, acting, designing, investing, and manufacturing green came to be understood by a critical mass of citizens, entrepreneurs, and officials as the most patriotic, capitalistic, geopolitical, and competitive thing they could do. Hence my motto, green is the new red, white, and blue. And I asked myself, in a way, looking back, when did that kind of awareness of the planet and its fragility first appear? And I think it was July the 20th, 1969, when, for the first time, man could look back at planet Earth. And in a way, it was Buckminster Fuller who coined that phrase. And before the kind of collapse of the communist system, I was privileged to meet a lot of cosmonauts in Space City and other places in Russia. And interestingly, as I think back, they were the first true environmentalists. They were filled with a kind of pioneering passion, fired about the problems of the Aral Sea. And at that period, it was, in a way, a number of things were happening. Buckminster Fuller was the kind of green guru, again, a word that had not been coined. He was a design scientist, if you like, a poet, but he foresaw all the things that are happening now. And it's another subject, it's another conversation. You can go back to his writings, it's quite extraordinary. It was at that time with an awareness fired by Bucky's prophecies, his concerns, as a citizen, as a kind of citizen of the planet, that influenced my thinking and what we were doing at that time. And it's a number of projects. I select this one.
这一点，
我想跟各位分享的是说，像 Norman Foster 这样子的，非常好的，而且做了很多著名的作品的建筑师，他在1969年代，因为听到或者是看到地球可以被从太空回过来看的时候，他第一次感受到地球是那么的脆弱，因为远远看它就是一个蓝色的球。我们本来站在地上，我们都觉得它非常的庞大，远远看它就是一个绿色的这个蓝色的球。那么他同时受到刚刚他讲的那位这个当时的一位设计家、思想家、诗人写的文章的这个影响，开始影响他对于设计的很多观念。我跟各位分享的意思就是说，任何的成熟的伟大的设计者，他都是被一个思想影响，他不是在做设计，他是在呈现他的思想。你没有思想，你不会变成伟大。所以最重要的就是他刚刚跟大家分享，他在年轻的时候，他受到谁的影响，谁说了什么样的话，影响到他对于整个设计的概念。
Because it was 1973 and it was a master plan for one of the Canary Islands, and this probably coincided with the time when you had the Planet Earth's source book and you had the hippie movement, and there is some of those qualities in this drawing which seeks to sum up the recommendations, and all the components are there which are now in common parlance in our vocabulary, 30 odd years later. Wind energy, recycling, biomass, solar cells, and in parallel at that time, there was a very kind of exclusive design club. People who were really design conscious were inspired by the work of Dieter Rams and the objects that he would create for the company called Brown. This is going back the mid-50s, 60s. And despite Bucky's prophecies that everything would be miniaturized and technology would make an incredible style, access to comfort, to amenities, it was very, very difficult to imagine that everything that we see in this image would be very, very stylishly packaged, and that and more beside would be in the palm of your hand. And I think that digital revolution now is coming to the point whereas the virtual world, which brings so many people together here, finally connects with the physical world, there is the reality that has become humanized, so that digital world has all the friendliness, all the immediacy, the orientation of the analog world, probably summed up in a way by the stylish or alternative available here, as we generously had gifted at lunchtime the Maxin, which is a further kind of development, and again inspired by the incredible sort of sensual feel and very, very beautiful objects. So something which in that 50s, 60s was very exclusive has now become, interestingly, quite inclusive. And the reference to the iPod as iconic and in a way evocative of performance, delivery. Quite interesting that the beginning of the year, 2007, the Financial Times commented that the Detroit companies envy the halo effect that Toyota has gained from the Prius as the hybrid, energy-conscious vehicle, which rivals the iPod as an iconic product. And I think it's very tempting to in a way seduce ourselves and as architects or anybody involved with the design process that the answer to our problems lies with buildings. Buildings are important, but they're only they're only a component of a much bigger picture. In other words, as I might seek to demonstrate, if you could achieve the impossible, the equivalent of perpetual motion, you could design a carbon-free house, for example. That would be the answer. Unfortunately, it's not the answer, it's only the beginning of the problem. You cannot separate the buildings out from the infrastructure of cities.
刚刚讲完的那句话有它的重要性，他说很多的做建筑设计的人，他都觉得他在做完这栋房子的时候，他就解决完了他的设计的问题。他在这边提到的是说，当你把房子设计完盖好的时候，才是问题的刚刚开始，因为这栋房子才要刚刚开始活在这个社会当中，所以我觉得这一点是重要的。
For example, if in that Bucky-inspired phrase we draw back and we look at planet Earth and we take a kind of typical industrialized society, then the energy consumed would be split between the buildings, 44%, transport, 34%, and industry. But again, that only shows part of the picture. If you look at the buildings together with the associated transport, in other words, the transport of people, which is 26%, then 70% of the energy consumption is influenced by the way that our cities and infrastructure work together. So the problems of sustainability cannot be separated from the nature of the cities of which the buildings are a part. For example, if you take and you make a comparison between a recent kind of city, what I'll call simplistically a North American city, and Detroit is not a bad example, it is very car dependent. The city goes out in annular rings, consuming more and more green space and more roads and more energy in the transport of people between the city center, which again, the city center, as it becomes deprived of the living and just becomes commercial, again becomes dead. If you compare Detroit with a city of a Northern European example, and Munich is not a bad example of that, with the greater dependence on walking and cycling, then a city which is really only twice as dense is only using 1/10 of the energy. In other words, you take these comparable.
各位有听懂这句话哈？底特律跟慕尼黑两个都市比，慕尼黑只用了1/10的能源，那这个但是它的密度其实是比较高。那为什么会是这样子呢？就是说，美国的都市的设计其实是一个用汽车在联系的设计，把住跟商分得那么远，那中间就是一大堆道路。这两个比较的例子，事实上到了21世纪的今天，我们来看，我们大概都可以了解20世纪走错了。
Leap is enormous. So basically, if you wanted to generalize, you can demonstrate that as the density increases along the bottom there, that the energy consumed reduces dramatically. Of course, you can't separate this out from issues like social diversity, mass transit, the ability to be able to walk a convenient distance, the quality of civic spaces. But again, you can see Detroit in yellow at the top. Extraordinary consumption down below Copenhagen. And Copenhagen, although it's a dense city, is not dense compared with the really dense cities. And in the year 2000, a rather interesting thing happened. You had for the first time megacities, 5 million or more, which were occurring in the developing world. And now, out of typically 46 cities, 33 of those megacities are in the developing world. So you have to ask yourself the environmental impact of, for example, China or India. If you take China and you just take Beijing, you can see on that traffic system and the pollution associated with the consumption of energy as the cars expand at the price of the bicycles. In other words, if you put onto the roads, as it's currently happening, 1,000 new cars every day, statistically. It's the biggest booming auto market in the world, and the 500 million bicycles serving 1 1/3 billion people are reducing. And that urbanization is extraordinary accelerated pace. So if we think of the transition in our society of the movement from the land to the cities, which took 200 years, then that same process is happening in 20 years. In other words, it is accelerating by a factor of 10. And quite interestingly, over something like a 60-year period, we're seeing the doubling in life expectancy over that period where the urbanization has trebled. If I pull back from that global picture and I look at the implication over a similar period of time in terms of the technology, which as a tool is a tool for designers, and I cite our own experience as a company, and I just illustrate that by a small selection of projects, then how do you measure that change of technology? How does it affect the design of buildings? And particularly, how can it lead to the creation of buildings which consume less energy, create less pollution, and are more socially responsible? That story in terms of buildings started in the late 60s, early 70s. The one example I take is a corporate headquarters for a company called Willis Faber in a small market town in the northeast of England, commuting distance with London. And here, the first thing you can see is that this building, the roof, is a very warm kind of overcoat, blanket, a kind of insulating garden, which is also about the celebration of public space. In other words, for this community, they have this garden in the sky. So the humanistic ideal is very, very strong in all this work, and encapsulated perhaps by one of my early sketches here, where you can see greenery, you can see sunlight, you have a connection.
所以这个是他在1969年、70年初对于设计的想法。当我们在最近几年有越来越多的建筑师开始把他的这个顶楼加了变成很多的绿地的时候，其实在那时候的那个小镇里头的那个建筑物的屋顶已经开始是一个绿化的一个地方。
The generator, the driver for this building. And symbolically, the colors of the interior are green and yellow. It has facilities like swimming pools, it has flexi time, it has a social heart, a space, you have contact with nature. Now this was 1973. In 2001, this building received an award, and the award was about a celebration for a building which had been in use over a long period of time. And the people who'd created it came back, the project managers, the company chairman then, and they were saying, you know, the architects, Norman was always going on about designing for the future, and, you know, it didn't seem to cost us anymore, so we humored him, we kept him happy. The image at the top, what it doesn't really, if you look at it in detail, really what it is saying is you can wire this building. This building was wired for change. So in 1975, the image there is of typewriters. And when the photograph was taken, it's word processors.
这栋楼在1969年设计，1970年开始用。在早期的时候，这边都是打字机，现在后来都变成是电脑。所以可以看到一个房子的寿命，因为房子的寿命短也有几十年，这几十年中间人类的一个科技的变化，对于环境的要求、灯光的变化、空气的这个变化等等，都有很大的影响。所以从它的这个经验来看，整体的这个建筑随着使用的变化，我觉得特别有意义。
On this occasion was that our competitors had to build new buildings for the new technology. We were fortunate because in a way our building was future-proofed. It anticipated change, even though those changes were not known. Round about that design period leading up to this building, I did a sketch which we pulled out of the archive recently. And I was saying, and I wrote, but we don't have the time and we really don't have the immediate expertise at a technical level. In other words, we didn't have the technology to do what would be really interesting on that building, and that would be to create a kind of three-dimensional bubble, a really interesting overcoat that would naturally ventilate, would breathe, and would seriously reduce the energy loads, notwithstanding the fact that the building is, as a green building, is very much a pioneering building. And if I fast forward in time, what is interesting is that the technology is now available, and celebratory, the Library of the Free University, which opened last year, is an example of that. And again, the transition from one of the many thousands of sketches and computer images to the reality, and a combination of devices here, the kind of heavy mass concrete of these book stacks, and the way in which that is enclosed by this skin, which enables the building to be ventilated to consume dramatically less energy, and where it's really working with the forces of nature. And what is interesting is that this is hugely popular by the people who use it. Again, coming back to that thing about the lifestyle, and in a way, the ecological agenda is very much at one with the spirit. So it's not a kind of sacrifice, quite the reverse. I think it's it's a celebration, and you can measure the performance in terms of energy consumption of that building against a typical library. If I show another aspect of that technology, then in a completely different context, this apartment building in the Alps in Switzerland, prefabricated from the most traditional of materials, but that material, because of the technology, the computing ability, the ability to prefabricate, make high-performance components out of timber.
他这一栋为什么要举出来？他在讲的意思是说，如果这一栋盖在瑞士的这个山坡上的这个房子，是在比他盖这栋房子更早不必多久，早个5、6年、7、8年，他就已经没有办法盖这栋房子了。因为这栋房子所需要的造型，他如果没有电脑去帮他算，他其实是做不出来。但是呢，这栋房子的工法是绝对传统，意思就是说，这栋房子在传统盖的时候，它会变成什么呢？它就是变成一个木屋，就是直的柱、斜的顶，然后外面全部是铺鱼鳞板，是木头的。所以但是那样子的房子对于保温、对于环境的这个和谐是非常好，所以它在那样子的一个基础下面去盖了一个新的造型的房子。那这种造型是因为有了科技的进步，所以它才能够往那个地方走去。
Out of timber, very much at the cutting edge. Very much at the cutting edge, and just to give a sort of glimpse of that technology, the ability to plot points in the sky, and to transfer that information now directly into the factory. So if you cross the border, just across the border, a small factory in Germany, and here you can see the guy with his computer screen, and those points in space are communicated, and on the left are the cutting machines, which then in the factory enable those individual pieces to be fabricated, and plus or minus very, very few millimeters to be slotted together on site. And then, interestingly, that building to then be clad in the oldest technology, which is the kind of hand-cut shingles, 1/4 of a million of them applied by hand as the final the final finish, and again, the way in which that works as a building for those of us who can enjoy the spaces to live and visit there. If I made the leap into these new technologies, then what happened before that? I mean, what was life like before the mobile phone? The things that you take for granted. Well, obviously the building still happened. I mean, this is a glimpse of the interior of our Hong Kong bank of 1979, which opened in 1985, with the ability to be able to reflect sunlight deep into the heart of this space here. And in the absence of computers, you had to physically model. So, for example, we would put models under an artificial sky. For wind tunnels, we would literally put them in a wind tunnel and blast air, and the many kilometers of cable and so on. And the turning point was probably, in our terms, when we had the first computer. And that was at the time that we sought to redesign, reinvent the airport. This is Terminal 4 at Heathrow, typical of any terminal. Big, heavy roof, blocking out the sunlight, lots of machinery, big pipes, whirring machinery. And Stansted, the green alternative.
在讲重新定义这个机场，所以我们可以看到机场从前的那种闹哄哄，看起来像是一个不受重视，只是需要大众集合的地方，到现在变成是一个非常愉快的地方。它的原因，他特别讲的这个概念，我觉得大家可以把它记住，就是因为他选择了，他不是为了要让大家这个快乐而去设计这个造型，他是为了要做绿色，结果让大家快乐。所以他是说，如果你可以把一个建筑物尽可能的去追求绿的设计，那么那个环境做好了以后，大家都会非常的开心。
It's natural light, it's a friendly place, you know where you are, you can relate to the outside, and for a large part of its cycle, not needing electric light which in turn creates more heat, which creates more cooling loads, and so on. And at that particular point in time, this was one of the few solitary computers, and that's a little image of the tree of Stansted. Not going back very far in time, 1990, that's our office. And if you looked very closely, you'd see that people were drawing with pencils and they were pushing, big rulers and triangles. It's not that long ago, 17 years, and here we are now. I mean, major transformation. Going back in time, there was a lady called Valerie Larkin, and in 1987, she had all our information on one disk. Now, every week, we have the equivalent of 84 million disks which record our archival information on past, current, and future projects. That reaches 21 kilometers into the sky. This is the view you would get if you look down on that. But meanwhile, as, wonderful protagonists like Al Gore are noting the inexorable rise in temperature, set in the context of that, interestingly, those buildings which are celebratory and very, very relevant to this place, our Reichstag project, which has a very familiar agenda, I'm sure, as a public place where we sought to, in a way, through a process of advocacy, reinterpret the relationship between society and politicians, public space, and maybe its hidden agenda, an energy manifesto, something that would be free, completely free of fuel as we know it. So it would be totally renewable. And again, the humanistic sketch, the translation into the public space, but this very, very much a part of the ecology. But here, not having to model it for real. Obviously, the wind tunnel.
的时候，他为了要 让真正的知道说他设计出来的想法是不是真的能够把太阳引进来，他必须要做一个模型，他必须要做一个天上都是灯的一个假的天空，他必须要做一个风洞，所以他才能够试验那栋楼真正是怎么样。那在设计这个德国的这个国会大楼的时候，他就一样的是从草图变到真正的这个环境的过程当中，那个实体实验已经不需要了。
Wind tunnel had a place, but the ability now with the computer to explore, to plan, to see how that would work in terms of the forces of nature, natural ventilation, to be able to model the chamber below, and to look at biomass, a combination of biomass, aquifers, burning vegetable oil, a process that quite interestingly was developed in Eastern Germany at the time of its dependence on the Soviet bloc, so really retranslating that technology and developing something which was so clean it was virtually pollution-free. You can measure it again. You can compare how that building, in terms of its emission in tons of carbon dioxide per year, at the time that we took that project over, 7,000 tons, what it would have been with natural gas, and finally with the vegetable oil, 450 tons. I mean, a 94% reduction, virtually clean. We can see the same processes at work in terms of the Commerzbank, its dependence on natural ventilation, the way that you can model those gardens, the way they spiral around. But again, very much about the lifestyle, the quality, something that would be more enjoyable as a place to work. And again, we can measure the reduction in terms of energy consumption. There is an evolution here between the projects, and Swiss Re again develops that a little bit further, the project in the city in London. And this sequence shows the build-up of that model, but what it shows first, which I think is quite interesting, is that here you see the circle, you see the public space around it. What are the other ways of putting the same amount of space on the site? If, for example, you seek to do a building which goes right to the edge of the pavement, it's the same amount of space. And finally, you profile this, you cut grooves into it. The grooves become the kind of green lungs which give views, which give light, ventilation, make the building fresher, and you enclose that with something that also is central to its appearance, which is a mesh of triangulated structures, again, in a long connection evocative of some of those works of Buckminster Fuller, and the way in which triangulation can increase performance and also give that building its sense of identity. And here, if we look at a detail of the way that the building opens up and breathes into those atria, the way in which now, with a computer, we can model the forces. We can see the high pressure, the low pressure, the way in which the building behaves rather like an aircraft wing. So it also has the ability all the time, regardless of the direction of the wind, to be able to make the building fresh and efficient. And unlike conventional buildings, the top of the building is celebratory. It's a viewing place for people, not machinery. And the base of the building is again about public space. Comparing it with a typical building, what happens if we seek to use such design strategies in terms of really large-scale thinking? And I'm just going to give two images out of a kind of company research project. It's been well known that the Dead Sea is dying. The level is dropping rather like the Aral Sea. And the Dead Sea is obviously much lower than the oceans and seas around it. So there has been a project which rescues the Dead Sea by creating a pipeline, a pipe, sometimes above the surface, sometimes buried, that will redress that and will feed from the Gulf of Aqaba into the Dead Sea. And our translation of that using a lot of the thinking built up over the 40 years, is to say, what if that, instead of being just a pipe, what if it is a lifeline? What if it is the equivalent, depending on where you are, of the Grand Canal in terms of tourists, habitation, desalination, agriculture?
各位不知道有没有听懂？他的意思是说，他们被要求做一个研究案，这个研究案是如何把这个死海救活。那基础就是要把从这个阿卡巴湾的这个海水把它带到死海去。那最简单的想法就是想一个管子，就像输油管一样把它铺过去。可是站在一个建筑家的想法里面，他觉得应该不是一条水管，而是一条地面上的生命线。那这个生命线，它同时可以让那个整个周遭，因为要连接，它本来是个坏事，它快要死了，我想要救它，所以这位医生想说，那我来救他的时候，我能不能同时把这个附近，因为我救活了他，我把附近的东西同时拉高，而不是只是救活他而已。所以他在想的方法是这个。
In other words, water is the lifeblood. And if you just go back to the previous image and you look at this area of volatility and hostility, that a unifying design idea as a humanitarian gesture could have the effect of bringing all those warring factions together in a united cause in terms of something that would be genuinely green and productive in the widest sense. Infrastructure at that large scale is also inseparable from communication. And whether that communication is the virtual world or it's the physical world, then it's absolutely central to society. And how do we make more legible in this growing world, especially in some of the places that I'm talking about, China, for example, which in the next 10 years will create 400 new airports. What form do they take? How do you make them more friendly at that scale? Hong Kong, I refer to as a kind of analog experience in a digital age because you always have a point of reference. So what happens when we take that and you expand that further into the Chinese society? And what is interesting is that produces, in a way, perhaps the ultimate mega building. It is physically the largest project on the planet at the moment. 50,000 people working 24 hours, 7 days. Larger by 17% than every terminal put together at Heathrow, built plus the new unbuilt Terminal 5. And the challenge here is a building that will be green, that is compact despite its size, and is about the human experience of travel, is about friendly, is coming back to that starting point, is very, very much about the lifestyle. And perhaps these, in the end, as celebratory spaces, as Hubert was talking over lunch as we sort of engaged in conversation, talked about this, talked about cities, Hubert was saying, absolutely correctly, these are the new cathedrals. And in a way, one aspect of this conversation was triggered on New Year's Eve, when I was talking about the Olympic agenda in China in terms of its green ambitions and aspirations. And I was voicing the thought that it just crossed my mind that New Year's Eve, a sort of symbolic turning point as we move from 2006 to 2007, that maybe, the future was, the most powerful, innovative sort of nation, the way in which somebody like Kennedy inspirationally could say, we put a man on the moon. Who is going to say that we cracked this thing of the dependence on fossil fuels, with all that being held to ransom by rogue regimes and so on. And that's a concerted platform. It's more than one device. It's renewable. And I voiced the thought that maybe at the turn of the year, I thought the inspiration was more likely to come from those other larger countries out there, the Chinas, the Indians, the Asian Pacific tigers. Thank you very much.